and a few of our friends from other parties that are not in Kenya Kwanza to give a statement on what we saw this morning. And the statement says as follows, that the country was this morning treated to the usual theatrics and a charade in the name of a dossier on the government-to-government oil deal signed between the government of Kenya, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. What Kenyans witnessed today is Mr. Odinga purporting to give what he had billed as a dossier, but which fell short of what can be described as a short script of hot air, political propaganda, and cheap street rumors. His purported dossier lacked any substance and is evidently part of his usual propaganda rumor mills. Mr. Odinga, however, rightfully stated that the Kenya's Ministry of Energy and Petroleum did sign a deal with state-owned petroleum companies in the Middle East, in Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, Aramco in Saudi Arabia and ADNOC in the United Arab Emirates. Please underline that it was Mr. Odinga who asserted that indeed there is a signed contract between the Ministry of Petroleum in Kenya and state-owned petroleum companies from Saudi Arabia and UAE. Our question, therefore, to Mr. Odinga is what further definition of government to government would this be seeking if a contract signed between a state-owned enterprise in Saudi Arabia and one in UAE and a state ministry in Kenya is not government to government? What then is his new definition of government to government? Because this contract is signed, as he asserted himself, between the state-owned enterprises and the Ministry of Petroleum and Energy in Kenya. Mr. Odinga alleges that the characterization of the oil deal as G2G, or government to government, was meant to shield some 3 Kenyan companies from paying 30% corporate tax. We are here today, Mr. Odinga, to adduce any evidence that any of the 3 companies have not been remitting their taxes, not just corporate tax, but all other taxes that are due from them. We will dare Mr. Odinga to adduce such evidence if what he was saying was not hot air, as we say, and political propaganda. But also maybe for the benefit of Mr. Odinga and his ilk, the 3 companies, that is Gulf Energy, Galana Oil, Kenya Limited, and Oryx Energies Limited, are not agents of the Kenya government and are not doing logistics on behalf of the Kenya government. These are agencies or agents appointed by Aramco and ADNOC, the 2 state-owned enterprises in Saudi Arabia and UAE, to act on their behalf to deal with local logistics. And indeed, since Mr. Odinga is in the oil industry business, he is aware that these 3 companies, even under the old OTC system, they were the leading companies in oil importation in this country. And indeed, 80% of all the oil that was imported into this country was being done, even under the old system, by these 3 companies. And probably that is the reason why the Aramco and ADNOC may have identified them as their local agents to deal with local logistics. Mr. Odinga also did speak to the dollar exchange rate. And we want to tell the former Prime Minister, it is time for once he became honest with Kenyans. Mr. Odinga knows that there are very many factors influencing our current foreign exchange rate and our foreign exchange reserves, because he was in the handshake regime only a year ago. And he knows what they did under the handshake regime. At the time, Mr. Odinga speaks about the Kenyan exchange rate between the Kenya shilling and dollar and attributes this to the G2G government deal. He is aware that under the previous regime, the handshake regime, which was a chief underwriter and offered insurance to the handshake regime to do all the things they did of state capture, Mr. Odinga is aware that they spent $2 billion of Kenya's foreign exchange reserves to prop up the Kenya shilling. The central bank governor only a week ago asserted that position, that our foreign exchange reserves were depleted under the former regime. That depletion was orchestrated through one commercial bank owned by the powers that be that were being underwritten by Mr. Odinga himself. And he knows that. And I would dare Mr. Odinga to come out and tell the world he does not know that they depleted Kenya's foreign exchange reserves to prop up our shilling, as the central bank governor said, in order to try and assuage Kenyans to vote for them. And that is how you found the Kenya shilling trading at an artificial pricing of in the range of 120 shillings. And I think we don't need to belabor that point since the central bank governor already alluded to it. Therefore, we're only saying Mr. Odinga knows there are many factors at play with the exchange rate. Mr. Odinga is also aware what happened during the handshake regime. And we want to tell you, and Kenyans are aware, and we want to remind Kenyans, that at the time President William Ruto took over the reins of leadership of this country in September of last year, the very first corporate entities and corporate groups that he had an appointment to see, sought an appointment to see him, and he met with them, were oil marketers in Kenya. We want to remind Kenyans that at the time, and this group was led by the CEO of Vivo Energy, and you can check because it is a public domain, the president did meet with oil marketers, and they told him they were choked by the policies of the previous regime that Mr. Odinga fervently supported. The oil marketers, we all remember, were struggling to raise an average of $500 million a month to be able to procure oil to sell in this country. Kenyans will recall that at the time there were product stockouts in many petrol stations, and Kenyans had to queue to get fuel. Today, no Kenyan has had to queue. And we've seen in some of our neighboring countries, motorists queuing, as was the case was in Kenya last year. Many small oil companies at the time that delegation visited the president were on the verge of closing shop, and indeed a few of them had closed shop, many of the small oil marketing companies, because they could not access fuel to sell. They could not access dollars in the market to be able to procure their fuel. And we all know that is when the mad rush for the dollar began. Courtesy, as I said, of the policies of the handshake regime that depleted all our foreign exchange reserves. It is only under this administration that we are trying to rebuild those foreign exchange reserves.